His speech came at a moment when we were so short of energy and so dependent on foreign energy sources that the President likened our energy crisis to the moral equivalent of war. It happens that whenever there are real or contrived resource shortages, it forces a nation to seize greater control of the economy in order to cope with the shortages. This alone would be a frightening condition considering the nature of the administration in power. But what's worse, we are literally surrounded with domestic energy resources. This is another one of the entrenched lies of the power elite. They have convinced the children of the New Age movements, that the earth is shrinking, that we're running out of everything, and that the most important thing to do is somehow feed the poor and limit population, etc., etc. It's amazing that the children of the light encamped with false gurus actually believe that the earth is running out of its major resources. Well, what do we see happening in the newspapers right now? Alaska is buying full-page newspaper ads to complain that they have 20 centuries worth of energy resources, but that they are not being developed because the government is preventing the development of many of them, which it says are on federal land. The headline reads, "Alaska wants America to declare a new Independence Day." This ad, paid for by the state legislation, says that in addition to lots of oil, the state has trillions of cubic feet of natural gas and enough coal for 20 centuries. Now, why do you think the government does that? The power elite, the Trilateralist Commission, have a policy of international economic interdependence. Interdependence is the theme of the New Age jargon of these individuals. Now, if we were suddenly to develop our resources in Alaska, it would make the United States of America economically, energy independent from all these manipulators in OPEC. Precisely what the power elite does not want: a strong, free, dynamic, independent America. That is why we're having this movement to have most of Alaska come under the protection of the federal government in the name of ecology. While we protect the wildlife, we are willing to throw away the souls of our people and the soul of our nation. And don't let me get started on the island off the coast of Alaska, actually owned by the United States, which the United States allows the Soviet Union to use as a concentration camp and as a base. It's what island? Wrangel Island. Wrangel Island. I'm sure if somehow the power elite could justify giving Alaska to the Soviet Union today, they would do it. Well, Alaska isn't the only area where the U.S. has great domestic energy deposits. We have known reserves of about 40 billion barrels of oil offshore in the Baltimore Canyon zone in the Atlantic. About another 40 billion in a rare 2 ecological zone near the Continental Divide. Both of these are not being developed due to environmental regulation and red tape. Yearly, the United States burns about 80 quads, or 80 quadrillion BTUs of all forms of energy. In pressurized zones off the Texas coast and the Gulf of Mexico, there are between 20,000 to 100,000 quads of natural gas. But most astounding, we have at least 6,000 years worth of coal. Most people believe the only way to use coal is to burn it. And we remember the olden days of the delivery of coal and all the dirt and soot and how messy it is, and maybe the oppression of coal miners, and it sounds like the worst way to go in energy. But this isn't true. Coal can be processed into crude oil or gasoline. Although the question seldom arises, why don't we turn our coal into gas? The usual answer is, we lack the technology. Patiently, petroleum engineers explain that the Germans are the leaders in coal gasification technology. This is true in one sense. But what most people don't know is that the Germans bought the technology from Standard Oil of New Jersey in the 1930s. This technology assisted German industry to an increase in its domestic oil and gas production from 300,000 tons of natural petroleum and 300,000 tons of synthetic gas annually to 6.5 million tons of oil annually, 5.5 million using the Standard Oil technology alone. From the days of John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, the legal monopolists in our political system have become ever more centralized and totalitarian in their methods. Consider for a moment the legal monopoly that was developed during the last century and perfected and enlarged upon on an ongoing basis. It was, as both Lenin and Professor Anthony C. Sutton have pointed out, the robber baron scheme of John Rockefeller, the socialist plan under a different label. The only difference between monopoly, capitalist, and socialist is merely the identity of the group controlling the power structure. We've said that earlier. We say it again because it's your point of the conveyance of the torch of the goddess of liberty, the torch of illumination. Since no one can benefit from that vast amount of profit that socialism brings to those who run the enterprise, their drive must necessarily be for power and control. Thus, they need the cooperation of the state. In the Soviet Union, this takes the form of state socialism. State socialism is the Soviet Union's brand of control. In the United States, it developed as corporate socialism. Corporate socialism is nothing more complicated than the development of a political and economic relationship between corporations and government to the point where the line between the two becomes indistinct and the owners and directors of the giant corporations direct the government even though they are not elected. Through economic and political control, the monopolists can remain out of sight and yet control the policies of a nation. The success of Rockefeller's gambit depended then, as it does now, upon remaining out of sight by focusing public attention on irrelevant and superficial historical questions. Deception is the essence of the strategy. One of the key ploys was to focus public attention on the supposed historical incompatibility between capitalists and communists. Now, as we pointed out earlier, the line of attack the large business firms took was that of government regulation. As Professor Sutton pointed out, regulatory agencies are devices to use the police power of the state to shield favored industries from competition, to protect their inefficiencies, and to guarantee their profits. Consequently, those who hold the few legal monopolies of financial and industrial control profit at the expense of all others in society. Just as a little side point, I'd like to mention that everywhere I went on the media on last year's stump, I was asked, sometimes sincerely and sometimes with great condescension and rebuke by the interviewers, about churches amassing great quantities of wealth and milking the people of their supply, and the need to have them no longer be nonprofit, etc., etc. And you'd hear on talk shows the rage of the people about the dishonest ministers and pastors, etc. But you never heard an outrage about the multinational corporations or Rockefeller or the control of the federal government by these monopolies, or the fact that we, by the sweat of our brow, are subsidizing these monopolies and multinational corporations. The lie cannot be that concealed. There must be something more. The lie must be a national hypnotism, which I said before must be pierced by the power of the Trinity. In the Trilateral Commission, we see the most obvious and most complete marriage of the corporate socialists and the government in our nation's history. Jimmy Carter, a former member of the Trilateral Commission, in and of himself does not hold power, even though we think the President of the United States would, by definition, hold power. Instead, he administers power on behalf of others, which in this case are the financial industrial interests centered in the Trilateral Commission itself. First among equals of the Trilateral Commissioners is David Rockefeller. The Rockefeller family, as we just pointed out, has enormous holdings, not the least of which is in the oil industry. Although this is not well known, oil companies are in reality energy companies because they have holdings in coal and nuclear energy as well as gas and oil. They are also in the forefront of developing alternative energy technologies. So, since they all go back to Rockefeller or to these power elites, are they really going to develop an energy alternative that is going to bring America out of the crisis? Why, they have a track record of following those policies that will control and limit the people. Not having enough energy severely limits your mobility. And mobility is the sign of the Chila, and mobility has been all but stopped in totalitarian states. To limit how far an individual can go by plane or by car limits his ability to act for freedom. Among many other things, it destroys the economy, destroys the flow of goods and services. So by control of energy, you can pull the trigger on inflation, recession, and ultimately revolution. When do revolutions happen? Not when people decide they should happen, when the power elite decides that it suits their moment. If a revolution can come out where they have centralized more power and more authority, then they let it happen, just by a simple manipulation of Wall Street, the stock market, or the Federal Reserve. So here we find oil companies controlling alternative energy technologies. It is hard to appreciate the importance of this. I'll give you an example. Germany has very small oil deposits. Thus, without such technology as they bought from Standard Oil Company, Germany would not have had the oil and gas necessary to fight World War II. Standard Oil of New Jersey kept Germany fighting for years by giving it the technology it needed. Not only did they provide the technology, but Standard Oil subsidized the process. U.S. Ambassador to Germany William Dodd in 1936 wrote in his diary, quote, "Why did Standard Oil Company of New York send $1 million over here in December 1933 to aid the Germans in making gasoline from soft coal for war emergencies?" You start looking at that and you realize that behind Holocaust, behind the gassing of millions of Jews and the horrendous deaths of many others, is not merely the Nazis, but the people who backed the Nazis, the power elite in Standard Oil of New Jersey. That was in preparation for a real war, not the moral equivalent thereof. But if we do not develop our existing resources with a technology developed by an ostensibly American firm over 40 years ago, will we be just as surely defeated as if it had been an obvious war, as opposed to an unseen war? Why aren't we using that technology today? Has Standard Oil lost the recipe? Well, if they have, Fluor Corporation, located in Southern California near San Diego, is right at this time building 3 or 4 plants for coal gasification in South Africa for the South African government. They will make crude oil out of coal. The South Africans are quite pleased with this technology. For one thing, it's cheaper than nuclear energy. This is more than a little odd. In the United States, our energy companies can develop any of their resources. At present, the corporate investment in nuclear energy is about $100 billion. Some believe that we are sticking with nuclear energy to preserve our investment, despite the dangers. There's no doubt in my mind that those who defend the safety of nuclear power plants here in California, where we have fault upon fault and danger of earthquake all the time, there's no question in my mind that the fallen ones in the energy companies who have invested $100 billion in these power plants are going to keep on saying that they're safe until they've gotten all of their money out of those plants. And that may take many, many years. Then there's another group of people, ironically, many people in the right wing of America, who are certain that the attack on the nuclear power plants is all a conspiracy, and they are the ones who are saying they're safe, 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 right in the face of 3 Mile Island. Well, I don't believe we should have nuclear power plants because I don't know who can guarantee this nation anywhere against cataclysm. Do you remember when they shut down a plant in New England because they said it couldn't stand an earthquake, and after they shut it down, lo and behold, New England had an earthquake? That happened just this year. We have enough coal in the United States and Alaska to transmute, if you will, to change into oil to solve all of our oil energy problems. We should do it today. We should write our dynamic decrees in this next 2-week period. We should meet. We should plan our strategies under the World Teacher for getting out that information. We need groups of people who are going to supplement the work of the messenger and do the research necessary so that there are no loopholes. It's possible that I have made a mistake in this research, or that committees have made mistakes in their research who have helped me. If we're going to publish, and if we're going to demonstrate, and if we're going to expose, we have to be responsible for every fact and figure and not be left vulnerable to criticism. If you come bearing the standard of the Ascended Masters and the Great White Brotherhood, you need a clean sword, and you need to be able to back your word and know the whole history from beginning to end. You have to become an expert on oil, on coal, on nuclear energy. Keepers of the flame who are in these fields around America, I invite you to come to Camelot and form a department at Summit University on energy. We need it, and we need it now. And if you don't have any background in the field and you're ready to go to college, you might consider it, because the world is hanging on this manipulation of forces in the Arab world, in OPEC, and it promises to do only one thing, and that is to get worse. And the Arabs justify their raising of crude oil prices on the basis that the dollar is becoming worth less and less. Well, those who make the dollar worth less and less have the same goal as OPEC, to have an international, interdependent economy and to level the United States and make her less than an equal on the world stage when she should be the leader and the shepherd nation of all. So for any other reasons than the safety of our people and the safety into the new age, I am interested in having all nuclear power plants shut down, because I don't trust the people running them, the people designing them, the people regulating them, the people that aren't there that should be guarding them from sabotage by enemies. I don't trust their ability to hold a flame or keep the flame around that much intense energy of alpha and omega. I'm too much aware of this generation of people who have had drugs, and I know the fallibility of their response mechanisms. I also know the fallibility of the designs and of the computers. And if all else goes well and they function well, what happens in cataclysm when the earth is polluted for the next how many thousands of years? Because cataclysm itself has exposed the power plant and its radioactivity to the elements, to the earth, and to whole populations. I don't think that the people of this planet have enough maturity on the path of initiation to handle nuclear energy, and I don't believe the Great White Brotherhood desires us to turn to it for peaceful uses. We have solar power, we have the conversion of coal and natural gas, and we have the untapped power of the sea itself. The ocean itself is an enormous focal point of energy. So that is my reason. And it doesn't go along with all of the reasons of other people that are demonstrating against the power plants. But for whatever reason, we have enough of a powder keg of the arsenals of nuclear weapons than to create a further point of vulnerability on our soil and the soils of nations. There's one thing about the fallen ones that you must understand, that as long as they are free and in the earth and able to amass power and enjoy it, they keep the earth running, and they keep the children of God as their slaves. But you know, the final judgment comes for them, and it's coming quickly. And in the final end, the last hours and days or century of their existence, it no longer matters if you keep the earth spinning. It no longer really matters if the whole thing blows up, because the rationale of these fallen ones is they're going to the last judgment, they pass to the second death, so when they've had their fun and enjoyed the planet for thousands of years at the expense of the light bearers, there's that moment of insanity, that moment of total cutting off from the heart or the feelings, when anyone among them could be the one that pulls the trigger, pulls the cord on massive explosions or nuclear war or the upset of power plants or whatever. It's like the madness of an Adolf Hitler. He is ready to destroy to gain power. And it reaches a point where the black magician becomes absolutely insane. Insanity in its first degree is the denial of God, Christ incarnate, and to desire to live outside of the Guru-Chela relationship. But in its end finality, insanity is the willingness to destroy everything because you yourself are being destroyed. That is the equation that I see in nuclear energy and power plants. I simply don't trust the earth in its present state to handle it. I champion your right to disagree with me. I want you to always remember that. I tell you what I believe and why I believe it, and if you believe something else and you have better reasons, I wish you'd tell me. Write and tell me so I have documentation in my files, because I'm always ready to learn from Chelas, from anyone. You know, Moria's motto is, if the messenger be an ant, heed him. And how do you know the ant is a messenger? By the word that he speaks, by the vibration. If the vibration is truth, accept it, no matter whose mouth it comes out of, because God works in mysterious and wondrous ways. So if a Chela corrects me on an opinion, I am most grateful. I am most grateful. Getting on with the trilateralists, they are internationalists. That means they have no loyalties to the group karma of the children of God that manifests as the nations of the earth. They are dedicated to building a world order and are not exclusively loyal to the United States or the American way of life. The American way of life is the way of the I am race. Nor are they loyal to any idea which would involve the average person in the decision-making process or acknowledge that he had any power or intelligence at all. Characteristic of that type of thinking is Zbigniew Brzezinski, our National Security Council advisor, who wrote that the American political system was based on assumptions that are increasingly becoming irrelevant, in that the representative system of government should be replaced by some sort of computing and planning society outside the legislative process that would separate the political system from society. Separate the political system from society. The word politics comes in its root meaning the people, right in the early Greek states, the people being responsible for their self-government. Brzezinski foresaw a time in which social crises might arise that would make it necessary for us to have a technocratic dictatorship which would arise as power gravitated into the hands of those who are able to control and correlate information most rapidly, thereby enabling them to respond to the rapid pace of change. Among other things, Brzezinski would like to alter or replace the Constitution. In case you have not heard me say it, The Constitution is a divine document of the Holy Trinity, inspired by Saint Germain upon the Founding Fathers, and its implementation, the implementation of the Trinity, depends on the rising mother flame in the children of God in America. They supply the mother flame, it supplies the Trinity. In Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, he wrote, "The approaching 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence could justify the call for a national constitutional convention to re-examine the nation's formal institutional framework. Either 1976 or 1989, the 200th anniversary of the Constitution could serve as a suitable target date culminating a national dialogue on the relevance of existing arrangements. Realism, however, forces us to recognize that the necessary political innovation will not come from direct constitutional reform, desirable as that would be. The needed change is more likely to develop incrementally and less overtly, under the table, in other words, in keeping with the American tradition of lessening distinctions between public and private institutions." Did you all know what he just said? He said we shouldn't be so obvious about throwing out the Constitution. It should gradually evolve to change in keeping with this tradition, which he calls American, of the lessening of distinctions between public and private institutions. That's not an American tradition, it's the tradition of the fallen ones. The question, was the monopoly type of capitalist development inevitable? Both Lenin and Karl Marx said that it was. In his 3-volume work, Das Kapital, Karl Marx tried to explain the dynamics or the laws of motion of capitalism. In essence, he saw capitalism as one stage in the history of civilization which had forces inherent within it, contradictions that would unalterably, scientifically bring about its collapse. The only contradictions in capitalism are the presence of the fallen ones within the free market economy. Marx believed that the forces of social change did not proceed from ideas, but from the society's economic life and conflict between social classes. Societies past and present consisted of but 2 classes, the ruling class and the toiling, oppressed class. This class distinction was a constant factor in all previous societies. All the while that civilization marched forward from primitive communism to slave states, to feudalism, to capitalism, which it did because the mode of production changed, which in turn altered the cultural superstructure of society, class distinctions always remained. Yet, to understand the dynamics of a capitalist society a la Marx, it is necessary to examine his theory of value and surplus value. As one of my favorite friends remarked recently, Marx was a ninny. You're going to hear how he's a ninny in these theories. Marx borrowed the labor theory of value from Adam Smith. In essence, it simply states that all value is produced by labor. This theory holds that the value of a commodity is equal to the work that went into it. If a suit of clothes takes twice as much labor to make as a purse, then suits will sell for twice the price of purses. The capitalist and the worker were, according to Marx, enemies by historical and economic necessity. The worker was a free agent who entered the market to dispose of the one commodity he commands, labor power. The capitalist was an entrepreneur trapped in an endless race against other entrepreneurs against whom he was compelled by the force of competition to accumulate enough capital to stay in business. If he didn't, his business would fail and his bankrupt operation would be purchased by another, but financially stronger capitalist. The law of survival was accumulate or be accumulated. Therein lies the rub. Under these circumstances, Marx wondered, how could a capitalist accumulate? Logically only from his profits. But could profits spring spontaneously from capital? No. The idea of something being created out of nothing was unacceptable to human reason, Marx wrote. It is inexplicable that more value should come out of production than went into it, for something cannot come out of nothing. Marx was sure, moreover, that no capitalist would dare raise his price above the competitive one. Under the circumstances, how could profit exist? This presented a contradiction. Profits might be explainable if there were monopolies in the system which could circumvent the leveling influence of competition, or if it was assumed that capitalists paid labor less than their worth. But Marx did not accept either of these propositions. Instead, he states that it will be pure capitalism, free trade, which will be the origin of his analysis and which, because of its contradictions, will proceed to its grave. The development of modern industry, he proclaimed in the Communist Manifesto, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeois produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeois produces above all are its own gravediggers. The laws of motion move the capitalist economy forward like this, Marx explains. The laborer will sell his product, his labor power, for what it is worth, much like the capitalist. From Marx's point of view, this turns out to be the exact amount of money required to keep that laborer alive, a subsistence wage. The laborer can ask no more. If a worker is not willing to work a full day, he doesn't get a job. However, like everyone else, he has no right and no power to ask for more than his worth as a commodity. In Marx's eyes, this system is perfectly equitable, with the one exception that all the workers are cheated because they are forced to work longer than it takes to earn their own sustenance. If we assume for a moment that it takes 6 hours of society's labor to maintain a working man and the price of labor is $1 an hour, then a working man is worth $6 a day and no more. But a laborer who gets a job works for more than 6 hours a day. He might work for 8 or 10 hours worth of value, yet will only be paid for 6. His wage will cover his sustenance, which is his true value and which is all that he's really entitled to. But the capitalist gets the money for the extra hours he has worked but hasn't been paid for, the surplus value or profit. This, according to Marx, is how profits enter the system, through the sweat of the brow of the laborer. Surplus value equals both profit and exploitation. The capitalist forced to work for profits is by definition an exploiter. This is the basis of the class struggle. Now you know why Marx is a ninny. The capitalist is forced by the system to do this, however. He is merely obeying the laws which require him to stay even with his competitors. When wages rise, as they inevitably do, he must introduce labor-saving machinery to cut his costs and thereby maintain his rate of profit. If he doesn't, his neighbor will, and as a result, he will develop a competitive edge. It is suicidal for a capitalist to allow a competitor to get ahead, but when he does substitute machinery for labor, it narrows the base from which he can extract profit, and he finds himself thus on the horns of a dilemma. The capitalist is forced to substitute a non-profitable means of production, machines, for a profitable one, workers. It's only labor, not machinery, that will produce value, says Marx. In Marx's theory, when a capitalist buys a machine, he pays full value for it. If the machine costs $1,000, it will never produce for him more than $1,000 worth of value. It is only from living labor that a capitalist can realize a profit, and that from the unpaid hours of surplus work time. It's almost unbelievable to believe that someone could sit down at a table and think up this theory, and that all kinds of people ever since could believe in it as some kind of a metaphysical reality. It is only from living labor that a capitalist can realize a profit, and that from the unpaid hours of surplus work time. Therefore, whenever the capitalist reduces the number or proportion of workers he employs, he is in effect killing the goose that lays the golden egg. But this is exactly what he does. Furthermore, consumption declines as machines displace men, and the number of employed workers fails to keep pace with the output. Bankruptcies ensue, and a capitalist's crisis is at hand. Smaller firms go under, and workers are thrown out of work. Machinery sold on the market by bankrupt capitalists is purchased by the stronger capitalists for less than their true value, and then once again, after a time, surplus value, i.e. profits, appear, and the capitalist ship of state seems to right itself again. But it does so only to repeat the same crisis of competition, high wages, acquisition of machinery, replacing labor, the decline of surplus value, frenzied competition, and crisis. Each crisis is successively worse than the preceding one. All of this proceeds with dialectical certainty until the breakdown, which is inevitable. As a result of the capitalist crisis, Marx postulated that overproduction in capitalist countries would lead them to search for foreign markets, colonies, where investments in foreign trade would yield higher rates of profit. It was possible to earn higher profits in foreign markets because capitalists could compete in a less highly developed environment against inferior competitors and thereby yield higher levels of profits while also exploiting the availability of slavery or forms of feudalism which might be available in backward societies. The colonies would become by necessity captive markets for capitalist overproduction. This is the theoretical origin of imperialism. Finally, as machinery replaced labor, commodities would become cheaper and large concentrations of capital would drive out smaller ones. This would lead to the centralization and concentration of capital because of the advantages of size and competition among producers. As a consequence of centralization, fewer and fewer laborers would be employed. The growth of monopoly would reduce the demand for labor, and ultimately capitalism would create increasingly severe economic depressions. They would be accompanied by massive misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. This would cause a revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers and disciplined, united, organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. Said Marx, centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. That was a favorite word of Marx, the integument. It means a covering. This integument bursts asunder, the knell of the capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. Now, Marx has endless statements such as these. Are his theories true? No, he makes several fundamental errors. First of all, the labor theory of value, which he borrowed from Adam Smith, is false. Smith said that labor alone, therefore, never varying in its own value, is alone the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared. Marx incorporated a second erroneous concept, one which came from economist David Ricardo, who said, "The natural price of labor is that price which is necessary to enable laborers to subsist and perpetuate the race without either increase or diminution." History has proven both of these theories to be untrue, yet Marx's entire economic analysis is built on them. Can it be true that a worker is bound by natural law to a subsistence wage? During Marx's early years, the idea might have seemed plausible. But even in Marx's time, workers lived at more than a subsistence level. Then there is the premise that since labor is the only source of value, when there is an increase in wealth, all increase must rightfully belong to labor. Therefore, the rich get rich at the expense of the poor. This is true only if labor is defined in a very narrow sense, including only those who did physical work. Other people contribute to the good of society in ways great or small, doing work and producing wealth, and therefore must in the broadest sense be considered labor. A philosopher who does nothing more than conceive of a better way for all to live is creating conditions for all others to produce more wealth. Even though he may not have lifted a finger, he has in essence done work. Should he not be compensated even though his contribution may be rather intangible? But Marx had yet another weakness, a misunderstanding of profit. In the days of a barter economy, men could exchange item for item. This was direct exchange, and presumably both parties were happy. In a money economy, people exchanged goods for money and then exchanged the money for other goods or services. This is called indirect exchange. Marx's basic idea was that a fair exchange existed only when someone took a commodity to the market, exchanged it for another of equal value in money, and then exchanged this money for another commodity of equal value he wanted. This is what he considered was a fair, indirect exchange. Capitalists did not do this. They made a profit which he thought was unfair. Some of the value which he believed had been produced by labor was being extracted by the capitalist. However, Marx does not take into consideration the subjective theory of value, which states simply that values exist in men's minds. Value is not objective, it is subjective. We value things based on our perception of their ability to satisfy some want or need that we have. Different men have different value scales. Furthermore, the same men have different value scales at different times. Consequently, the values of goods are constantly changing because their subjective worth to any individual or a group of individuals is continually changing. Look at the price of gasoline. When you can't get anywhere, you're willing to pay any price. When it's plentiful, you'll shop for the lowest price. Who would have ever thought we would have said gasoline is worth $1.10 a gallon to us? Well, it's worth it if you want to get somewhere and your mission is more important than $1.10 a gallon. You buy the gas and you get there. This is true with everything we have. Some people would pay $100 for a book by the Ascended Masters. Some people wouldn't pay anything. For everyone, the value is different. And everyone has a right to value things differently and to be willing to pay the price that he feels something is worth.